Rabaul, New Britain, August 1942. The report arrived on a Tuesday, typed on thin paper by an intelligence clerk who had never seen the aircraft he was describing. Petty Officer First Class Hiroyoshi Nishizawa read it twice, then set it on the table beside his dinner. Around him, the other pilots of the 204th Air Group were eating in the open-sided mess hall, the evening heat of Rabaul pressing down on everything with the particular weight of a climate that had never been asked to accommodate a war. Someone was playing a harmonica badly near the far wall. Two pilots were arguing about the merits of a particular approach vector over Guadalcanal. It was, in all the ways that mattered, an ordinary evening. Nishizawa was 23 years old. He was thin to the point of appearing fragile, with large, dark eyes that other pilots described, always in the same words, as the eyes of a man who sees more than he says. He had been flying combat since China. He had, by the count his superiors kept, and he himself did not discuss, destroyed more than 50 enemy aircraft. He was not the loudest man in the room, nor the most decorated, nor the one most likely to hold the room's attention at dinner. He was simply, by the testimony of everyone who flew with him, the most dangerous. He read the intelligence report a third time. The aircraft being described was American. Twin engines mounted on two separate tail booms extending behind the wings, meeting at a central horizontal stabilizer. A pilot's gondola suspended between the booms. Armament concentrated in the nose. 4 machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all firing forward without the synchronization complications of propeller-mounted weapons. The report noted a maximum speed in excess of 600 kilometers per hour. Service ceiling above 12,000 meters. The pilot beside him, a broad-shouldered man named Ota, who had 11 victories and considered himself an authority on American aviation, leaned over and read the last paragraph. Then he laughed. 2 engines, Ota said. 2 tails. They built a cargo plane and put guns on it. He reached across and pushed the report back toward Nishizawa with one finger, the gesture of a man returning something that does not warrant serious attention. Our grandmothers could shoot this down. Around the table, the men who had been listening laughed. It was a comfortable laugh, the laugh of men who have been winning for 3 years and have accumulated, through the compounding interest of continuous victory, a confidence that has begun to feel less like an assessment and more like a fact of nature. Nishizawa did not laugh. He picked up the report again and read the specification that the others had not paused on. Service ceiling above 12,000 meters. He looked at this number with the careful attention of a craftsman examining a flaw in an otherwise sound piece of work. Then he asked a question that stopped the laughter at his end of the table, not because it was dramatic, but because it was delivered in the same quiet tone he used for everything. "What is our ceiling?" he said. Ota blinked. "The 0? 11,000, perhaps 11.5 in clean configuration, good conditions." "And this aircraft," Nishizawa said, "flies above 12,000. A brief silence. Not the silence of men who have understood something, but the silence of men who have heard something they have decided not to understand. Then the conversation resumed. The harmonica continued badly near the far wall. Someone refilled his cup. Nishizawa folded the report and placed it in the breast pocket of his flight suit. He ate the remainder of his dinner without speaking. This was not unusual. He frequently ate without speaking. The other pilots had long since stopped interpreting his silences as anything other than his natural disposition. They were wrong about this, as they were wrong about the report. He lay awake that night in the narrow bunk he had occupied for 4 months, listening to the sounds of Rabaul, the distant surf, the intermittent drone of a transport somewhere over the harbor, the breathing of men asleep around him who had not asked the question he had asked and were therefore sleeping better than he was. He thought about 12,000 meters. He thought about what it meant to fight an enemy who lived above the altitude you could reach. He thought about every engagement he had ever flown, every advantage he had ever exploited, every moment when the outcome had turned on his ability to climb faster, turn tighter, arrive at the correct position before his opponent. All of it assumed a shared ceiling, a common sky, a fight conducted within the same vertical boundaries. He thought about what happened if those boundaries were not shared. He did not write these thoughts down. He was not a man who committed his assessments to paper unless he had to. But he remembered the number, 12,000 meters. He would remember it for the rest of his life, which was not, though he did not know this yet, as long as he believed. Outside, Raboul breathed in the August darkness, enormous and indifferent, certain of nothing. Burbank, California, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, spring 1941. The prototype stood in the far corner of the assembly building under lights that made everything look slightly unreal. Too bright at the center, too shadowed at the edges, the way important things sometimes appear when you are standing close enough to touch them. Clarence Kelly Johnson walked around it slowly, the way he always walked around a finished aircraft before it flew. Not inspecting. He had inspected every component a dozen times already, in drawings, in mock-ups, in the arguments that had consumed 18 months of his life. This was something different. This was the moment when an engineer stops being an engineer and becomes, briefly, a pilot. Imagining what it would feel like to sit inside the thing he had built and ask it to do what he had promised it could do. Johnson was 31 years old, the son of a Swedish immigrant, educated at the University of Michigan, employed by Lockheed since he was 23. He was not tall, not physically imposing, not the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. He filled rooms with his precision, with the particular quality of attention he brought to problems that other engineers had decided were unsolvable. The quality of a man who does not accept the word unsolvable as a final answer, but merely as an invitation to ask a better question. The question the Army Air Corps had asked in February of 1937 had seemed, to most of the industry, unanswerable. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of exceeding 640 kilometers per hour, reaching an altitude of 6,000 meters in 6 minutes, with a range sufficient for extended escort missions over distances that no single-engine fighter of the era could cover. They wanted, in other words, an aircraft that did not yet exist and that the accepted principles of aeronautical engineering suggested could not exist, not within the weight and power constraints of available technology. Johnson had looked at the specification for 3 days before arriving at the answer. Not a single large engine, but 2 smaller ones. Not a conventional fuselage, but twin booms extending from each engine nacelle, meeting at a central stabilizer. The pilot's gondola suspended between them, housing the armament in the nose, where the guns could fire without synchronization gear, without the mechanical compromises that propeller clearance imposed on every other fighter in the world. It was, on paper, an absurd-looking machine. His colleagues said so, with the diplomatic candor of men who respected him enough to be honest. Twin booms, twin engines, a gondola like a gondola. It looked like something a child might design if given too much freedom and not enough constraint. Johnson had listened to all of it and built it anyway. Now it stood before him, the XP-38, and it did not look absurd. It looked, in the way that correct solutions to difficult problems sometimes look, inevitable. The twin booms swept back from the wing roots with a cleanliness that single-engine fighters, burdened by their own fuselages, could not achieve. The turbo superchargers, the component that Johnson considered the aircraft's true heart, the mechanism that would maintain engine power at altitudes where other fighters faded, sat behind each engine, feeding compressed air into the Allison V1710s with the quiet efficiency of a system that had been designed to work and then designed again until it actually did. A young pilot was waiting near the tail. Second Lieutenant Richard Bong, 21 years old, from Poplar, Wisconsin, where his father grew strawberries and his mother had not yet fully accepted that her son was going to spend the war in the sky. He had been assigned to Lockheed for familiarization flights, one of a rotating group of Army Air Corps pilots sent to learn the aircraft before it reached the squadrons. Johnson watched him climb into the cockpit. Bong settled into the seat with the unhurried ease of someone who has found a place that fits, adjusting the shoulder straps, running his hands over the instrument panel with the light, exploratory touch of a man reading something in a language he is just beginning to understand. "How does it feel?" Johnson called up. Bong looked down at him. He was quiet for a moment, the way young men from Wisconsin are quiet when they are forming an opinion they intend to stand behind. "Like I get to decide," he said. Johnson looked at him. "Decide what?" "Everything," Bong said. He was not being poetic. He was being precise, in the way that good pilots are precise, describing the sensation of sitting in a machine that for the first time gave him more options than it took away. More altitude than the enemy, more speed in the dive, more range than anyone expected. The ability to enter a fight on his own terms, or decline it on his own terms, or arrive somewhere that the enemy had calculated was unreachable and find them there, surprised, already behind. Johnson nodded slowly. He had spent 18 months solving an engineering problem. The young man from Wisconsin had just described, in 4 words, what the solution actually meant. The prototype flew its first full performance evaluation 3 weeks later. The test pilot's report noted a service ceiling that exceeded 12,000 meters. In Rabaul, a folded intelligence report sat in the breast pocket of a flight suit belonging to a man who had asked the right question and was still waiting, though he did not know it, for the answer to arrive. It was on its way. Guadalcanal, Henderson Field, November 18, 1942. The briefing was short. Captain John Mitchell stood before 12 pilots in the pre-dawn darkness of Henderson Field and described the mission in the economical language of a man who considers unnecessary words a form of dishonesty. Escort duty. Boeing B-17 outbound to Bougainville. Japanese fighters expected over the target. Standard formation. Altitude advantage to be maintained at all costs. The last instruction was not standard. It was specific to the P-38, and the pilots who had been flying the Lightning for 3 weeks understood what it meant without Mitchell having to explain it. Do not follow the zero down. Do not accept the turning fight. Do not descend to the altitude where the enemy's advantages become your disadvantages. Stay high. Stay fast. Come down only when you choose to, at the angle you choose, for the duration you choose. Richard Bong was not on this mission. He was still in Australia, completing his transition training, learning the twin-engine procedures that the P-38 demanded of pilots accustomed to single-engine aircraft. But the pilots who lifted off Henderson Field that morning carried the same understanding he had articulated in the Lockheed Assembly Building 6 months earlier, formed now not from a cockpit impression, but from 3 weeks of combat over the Solomons. They got to decide. The Japanese fighters appeared at 21,000 feet, climbing from the north in the loose formation that experienced Zero pilots preferred. Enough separation to maintain visual contact, enough flexibility to respond to threats from multiple directions. They were escorting their own bombers, which sat below them at 17,000 feet, and they had positioned themselves with the practiced confidence of men who have flown this route many times and know precisely where the threats come from and how to handle them. They did not look up. This was the habit that 3 years of air superiority had built into Japanese fighter pilots. A habit so deeply grooved by experience that it had ceased to be a conscious choice and had become instead a kind of professional instinct. You looked for threats at your altitude and below. Below was where threats came from. Below was where Allied fighters lived, struggling to climb, fighting the thin air, arriving at the engagement already tired from the effort of reaching it. The P-38s were at 26,000 feet. Lieutenant Rex Barber, leading the first flight, rolled inverted and looked down through his canopy at the Japanese formation 5,000 feet below. The geometry was clean. The Zero pilots had not seen them. The B-17s were still 15 miles out, not yet the focus of Japanese attention. There was, for a moment that Barber would later describe as feeling much longer than it actually was, a perfect stillness. The stillness of a situation that has not yet become what it is about to become. He pushed the nose down. The P-38 accelerated in the dive with the solid, purposeful momentum of an aircraft that weighs twice what it is attacking and has been waiting for permission to use that weight. The Allison engines did not strain. They simply delivered what they had been delivering at 26,000 feet. Full power, full supercharger engagement, the same performance at altitude that they produced at sea level. The feature that Japanese engineers had not built into the Nakajima Sakai and could not retrofit into it now. The first Zero pilot died without understanding what had happened. The second saw the twin boom silhouette pull away vertically after the firing pass and did what his training told him to do. He pulled back on the stick and climbed after it. His Zero, at 21,000 feet with a Nakajima Sakai producing perhaps 750 horsepower in the thin air, climbed at a rate that had been, until this morning, faster than anything he had ever needed to outclimb. The P-38 climbed faster. He watched it go. He held the climb until his airspeed decayed to the edge of a stall, and the lightning was still rising above him, still accelerating, moving away with the unhurried ease of something that has more altitude to give and knows it. He pushed the nose down and searched for friendlies and found them, and rejoined the formation, and said nothing on the radio because there was nothing useful to say. 3 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in the engagement. No P-38s were lost. That evening, Mitchell wrote his mission report in the spare prose that combat reports require, and did not include the observation that had formed in his mind somewhere over the target and stayed with him on the flight home. He did not write it because it was not the kind of thing that belonged in a mission report, but he thought it, precisely and without drama, the way a good pilot thinks things that matter. For the first time in this war, he thought, we fought on our terms. He folded the report and went to find dinner. Outside, Guadalcanal settled into its tropical night, indifferent to what had changed above it. Rabaul, 204th Air Group, late November 1942. The debriefing lasted 2 hours. Nishizawa sat at the end of the table and listened without interrupting. This was his method. Let the men speak first, in whatever order the words came, without the distorting pressure of questions that implied what answers were expected. He had learned, over 3 years of combat, that the most useful information lived not in the formal structure of a report, but in the hesitations, the corrections, the moments when a pilot stopped mid-sentence and started again because the first version had not quite captured what he had actually seen. There were 3 pilots. They had returned from the escort mission over Bougainville with their aircraft intact and their composure less so. They were experienced men, between them more than 40 victories. They were not prone to confusion or exaggeration. What they described, therefore, Nishizawa took seriously. The first pilot had seen the P-38s only after they attacked. Twin booms, he said, unmistakable once you knew what to look for. They came from above, far above, 5,000 feet at least over the formation. The dive was fast, faster than anything he had seen from an Allied fighter. The firing pass lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then they climbed away. Climbed away, Nishizawa said. It was his first words in 40 minutes. Vertically, the pilot said. He paused. I followed. I climbed until I nearly stalled. Another pause, shorter. They were still above me when I broke off. The second pilot had attempted the same pursuit and arrived at the same result. The third had not attempted it. He had watched the first 2 try and had made, in the 3 seconds available to him, the calculation that attempting it himself would produce a third data point identical to the first 2, at the cost of his life if the P-38 chose to reverse and attack during his stall recovery. He had, instead, dived away and survived. Nishizawa looked at this third pilot for a moment. In a different conversation, in a different air force, the decision to dive rather than climb might have required justification. Here, Nishizawa simply nodded once. the nod of a man who recognizes a correct decision when he hears one described, and returned his attention to the table. He sat in silence for a while. Around him, the other pilots waited with the particular patience of men who have learned that his silences are not empty. The intelligence report from August was still in his breast pocket. He had moved it from flight suit to flight suit for 3 months, not from sentimentality, but from the habit of keeping things that had not yet finished being useful. He took it out now and placed it on the table without unfolding it. Everyone in the room recognized it. He had shown it to no one, but word had traveled, as words do in small units, that Nishizawa had asked a question at dinner in August that no one had thought to ask. 12,000 meters, he said. No one spoke. We fight at 7,000. 8,000 on a good day, in clean configuration, with experienced pilots who know how to manage the climb. He looked at the folded report. They live at 12,000. They come down when they choose. They return to 12,000 when they choose. He paused. We cannot follow them up. We cannot prevent them from coming down. We can only react to the moment they select. The senior officer in the room, a lieutenant commander named Sasai, who had 27 victories and the authority to disagree, said nothing. This was itself a kind of answer. Nishizawa did not say what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was not yet something he could put into words that would be useful to anyone in the room. He was thinking about the nature of a fight in which one side chooses the terms and the other side responds to them. He had spent 3 years being the side that chose the terms. He understood from that experience what it meant for the other side. He understood it in his body, in the reflexes that combat had built into him over hundreds of engagements, the reflexes of a man who had always, until now, possessed more options than his opponent. He folded the report and replaced it in his pocket. That night, he wrote a single line in the small notebook he kept beside his bunk. He wrote it not as an assessment for his superiors, but as a private acknowledgement of something he needed to say clearly to himself before he could think past it. The sky has a new owner. We do not yet know what he intends to do with it. He closed the notebook. Around him, the men of the 204th Air Group slept the sleep of men who had fought well and expected to fight well again tomorrow, and who had not yet fully understood what the evening's debriefing had actually contained. Nishizawa lay awake for a long time, listening to Rabao breathe in the darkness. Guadalcanal, Fighter II Airstrip, April 17, 1943. The briefing room smelled of kerosene and damp canvas. Major John Mitchell stood before 16 pilots and described a mission that should not have been possible. His voice was level, the way voices are level when the speaker has already made peace with what he is asking. The intelligence had arrived 48 hours earlier, decoded from a Japanese naval cipher that American cryptanalysts had been reading for months with the patient, invisible diligence of men whose work existed in a category beyond acknowledgement. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, architect of Pearl Harbor, the most important military mind in the Imperial Japanese Navy, would be flying from Rabaul to Balal Island on the morning of April 18th. His itinerary had been transmitted in precise detail: departure time, route, expected arrival, the number and type of aircraft in his escort. 18 Zero fighters, 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers carrying the admiral and his staff. The distance from Guadalcanal to the interception point was 435 miles over open ocean. There was no land navigation reference for most of the route. The interception had to occur within a window of minutes. Yamamoto was known for punctuality with the inflexible precision of a man who considered lateness a form of disrespect, which meant the P-38s had to arrive at a specific point in the sky at a specific moment after flying more than 400 miles at low altitude. Without radio communication, without the ability to correct course errors until the target was either visible or irretrievably missed. No other American fighter in the Pacific could fly this mission. The F-4F Wildcat lacked the range. The P-40 lacked the range. The P-39 lacked the range and the altitude performance, and at this point in the war, most of its credibility. The P-38, with drop tanks extending its range beyond what its designers had originally specified, could reach the interception point with minutes of fuel to spare, provided Mitchell's navigation was exact, provided the timing held, provided the Japanese did not alter the itinerary, provided 16 pilots maintained radio silence for 2 hours over featureless ocean at 50 feet above the waves. Mitchell had spent the previous night with charts and a stopwatch, calculating the course corrections that would be required at each waypoint, accounting for wind drift, accounting for the time lost in the initial low-altitude approach, accounting for the climb to interception altitude that would need to happen in the final minutes before contact. He had done this alone, by lamplight, with the focused solitude of a man who understands that the arithmetic either works or it does not, and that no amount of optimism will correct a navigation error over open ocean. The arithmetic worked. He briefed the mission in segments, the way complex operations are briefed. First the route, then the timing, then the attack assignments, then the contingencies. The attack flight of 4 aircraft would go for the bombers. The cover flights would hold altitude and engage the Zero escorts. Nobody was to break off the attack to pursue retreating Japanese fighters. Nobody was to extend the engagement beyond the fuel margins Mitchell had calculated. The mission had one objective, and the objective was not aerial combat. The pilots listened without questions. This was not the silence of men who had no questions. It was the silence of men who understood that the questions they might ask, about what it meant to hunt down and kill a specific named individual, about the difference between this and the combat they had been flying, were not questions for a briefing room. Those questions belonged to the long hours between missions, to letters that would not pass the censors, to the private arithmetic that every combat pilot performs and does not discuss. Lieutenant Rex Barber, assigned to the attack flight, studied the chart on the table after the briefing ended. He traced the route with one finger, the long westward leg at low altitude, the turn north, the climb in the final minutes. He had flown 400 miles in a P-38 before. He had not done it at 50 feet above the ocean in radio silence, with the knowledge that the margin for error was measured in seconds. He rolled the chart and went to find his aircraft. The 16 P-38s lifted off Fighter II before dawn. They formed up in the darkness over the water and turned west, descending immediately to 50 feet, low enough that Mitchell, looking sideways from his cockpit, could see the propeller wash disturbing the surface of the ocean below him. The Japanese radar stations along the coastline were calibrated for targets at altitude. At 50 feet, the lightnings were invisible to them. 16 twin-boomed silhouettes racing westward in the gray Pacific morning, carrying an appointment that one man did not know he had made. Mitchell checked his watch. They were 30 seconds ahead of schedule. He adjusted the throttle fractionally and flew on. Rabaul, 204th Air Group, April 19, 1943. The news arrived by telephone at 9:30 in the morning. Nishizawa was on the flight line when the duty officer came to find him, walking between the parked Zeros with the unhurried attention he gave to aircraft before missions, checking cowlings, running his hand along a control surface, the small rituals of a pilot who understands that the relationship between a man and his machine is not abstract. The duty officer said 3 words. Nishizawa stopped walking. He stood with his hand resting on the leading edge of a Zero's wing and looked at nothing in particular for a moment that the duty officer would remember for the rest of his life. Then he nodded once and walked back toward the operations building. Yamamoto was dead. The details filtered in through the morning in the fragmentary, contradictory way that information arrives when the people reporting it are still trying to understand what they witnessed. The escort pilots who had survived, 6 Zero pilots from the 18 assigned, the others having been pulled into combat with the P-38 cover flights, gave their accounts separately, and the accounts agreed on the essential facts, while differing on the details the trauma introduces into memory. The Americans had appeared from below the tree line. This was the phrase that recurred across multiple testimonies, and it was the phrase that Nishizawa fixed on, because it contained within it the entire operational logic of what had been done. Below the tree line. The P-38s had flown the approach so low, for so long, that the escort pilots scanning the sky for threats had not thought to look at the horizon. The attack had come not from above, the direction every trained fighter pilot monitors with the instinctive vigilance of a man who knows that altitude is advantage, but from the level of the trees. 435 miles. Nishizawa knew the distance because he had looked at the chart himself after the first fragmentary reports, tracing the route from Guadalcanal to Balale with the same finger he used to check control surfaces. 435 miles over open ocean, at low altitude, in radio silence, arriving within seconds of the scheduled time. He sat in the operations building for a long time after the last report had been read. What occupied him was not grief, exactly, though grief was present. What occupied him was the operational question, the professional, technical, dispassionate question that combat had trained him to ask about everything he witnessed. He asked it now, applied to what the Americans had done, and the answer assembled itself with the cold clarity of arithmetic. They had read the signal. This much was obvious. The precision of the interception admitted no other explanation. But reading the signal was only the beginning. Someone had then solved a navigation problem of considerable difficulty, calculating a course over featureless ocean that delivered 16 aircraft to a specific point at a specific moment. Someone had trained pilots to maintain formation at 50 feet above the waves for 2 hours without the navigational references that made such flying manageable. Someone had allocated aircraft with enough range to reach the target, execute the attack, and return. Range that the Zero, for all its celebrated endurance, could not have matched on the outbound leg alone, while carrying the fuel for combat. Every element of the mission had required a capability. Every capability had been present. Nothing had been improvised. Nishizawa understood, sitting in that operations building with the report spread before him, that he was not looking at a fortunate interception. He was looking at a system, a coordinated, rehearsed, technically precise system that had been designed to do exactly what it had done, and that would do it again whenever the intelligence and the opportunity aligned. The Zero escort had been 18 aircraft, experienced pilots, well-positioned, flying a route they knew. They had not been negligent. They had been operating correctly within the framework of everything their training had prepared them for. The framework was wrong. He walked outside into the Rabaul afternoon. The flight line was quiet. Several pilots were sitting in the shade near the operations building, talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw his face and then started again, because there was nothing useful to say and silence felt worse. Nishizawa looked at the sky above Rabaul, the brilliant, indifferent Pacific sky that he had owned, in the only sense that mattered, for 3 years. He looked at it for a long time. The sky looked back, revealing nothing. He went to find paper and wrote a mission report that described the facts without interpretation, because interpretation was not what mission reports required. The interpretation he kept, as he kept everything that mattered, in the silence behind his eyes. Yamamoto had traveled with 18 escorts and had died anyway. Distance had not protected him. Escorts had not protected him. The careful scheduling that expressed his legendary punctuality had, in the end, been the instrument of his death. A timetable transmitted in confidence, received by people who understood precisely what to do with it. Nothing, Nishizawa understood now, was beyond reach. The thought did not frighten him. He was not, by nature or by 3 years of combat, easily frightened. But it settled into him with the particular weight of a fact that changes the shape of everything around it. Quietly, permanently, without the drama that important things sometimes announce themselves with. He folded the mission report. He went back to the flight line. There was, after all, still a war. New Guinea, Dobadura Airstrip, January 1944. The letter home was 3 pages long. Richard Bong wrote slowly, the way men write when they are trying to be honest about something that resists honest description. He was sitting on an ammunition crate outside his tent in the late afternoon, the paper balanced on a logbook, the pencil moving in the unhurried manner of someone who has decided that this particular letter will say what the previous ones had not quite managed to say. He was 23 years old. He had 31 confirmed victories. General George Kenney, commanding Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, had twice attempted to ground him. Not as punishment, but as preservation. The way you preserve something that has become too valuable to risk in the ordinary way. Both times Bong had found methods of continuing to fly that satisfied the letter of Kenney's orders, while accommodating his own judgment about where he was most useful. Kenney had stopped being surprised by this. He had started being resigned to it instead, which was a different thing. The letter was to his mother. He wrote to her every week, letters that passed through the censor with minimal difficulty because they contained almost no military information. They contained, instead, observations about the weather, about the food, about the men he flew with, about the particular quality of light over New Guinea in the early morning when the mist was still on the mountains and the war had not yet started for the day. Tonight he was trying to write about the aircraft. He had been trying to explain the P-38 to his mother for 18 months, and each attempt had arrived at the same difficulty. The qualities that mattered most about the Lightning were not the qualities that appeared in the specifications. Not the speed, not the ceiling, not the armament, not the twin-engine survivability that had brought him home twice on a single engine over water that he did not want to think about swimming in. The qualities that mattered were harder to name. He wrote, "The thing about this airplane is that it gives you time to think." He stopped and looked at what he had written. It was not quite right, but it was closer than anything he had written before, so he continued. In the P-40, you were always reacting. Something happened and you responded to it and hoped your response was fast enough. In the P-38, you are usually above whatever is happening. You can see it forming. You can decide whether to enter it or not, and if you decide to enter it, you can decide how. That sounds like a small difference. It is not a small difference. He had been trying, without quite finding the words, to describe what it felt like to possess the vertical dimension of a fight absolutely. To be the pilot who determined altitude, who selected the moment of engagement, who could decline combat when the geometry was wrong and return when it was right. He had encountered this quality first in the Lockheed Assembly Building in California, sitting in the prototype cockpit while Kelly Johnson watched from below, and he had named it then with the compressed accuracy of a man saying something true before he has time to make it complicated. Like, I get to decide. 31 victories later, the description still held. What had changed was his understanding of what deciding actually cost. Not in danger, which he had made a separate peace with long ago, but in the particular weight of choosing, each time, to go down into something from which the return was probable, but not guaranteed. He wrote for another hour. The letter covered the usual ground, the weather, the food, a description of a flight over the Owen Stanley Range at dawn that had been, in its way, the most beautiful thing he had seen since leaving Wisconsin. He did not write about the arithmetic that Kenney's staff briefed each week. Japanese aircraft destroyed, Japanese pilots lost, the compounding deficit between what Japan was losing and what Japan could replace. He did not write about it because his mother did not need to know it, and because, in a way he could not fully articulate, it made him uncomfortable. Not the victories themselves, the mathematics behind them, the way the numbers told a story about an enemy that was running out of the thing that could not be manufactured or replaced or recovered once it was gone. He had seen it in the quality of the pilots he was fighting now. 18 months ago, a Japanese pilot in a Zero was a serious problem, regardless of altitude or geometry. You made mistakes against them, and the mistakes were punished with a precision that left no ambiguity about what you had done wrong. Now, occasionally, he made mistakes, and the punishment did not come. The pilot on the other end of the mistake was not yet good enough to deliver it. This troubled him more than the dangerous ones had. He folded the letter, addressed it, and placed it with the others for the mail run. The New Guinea evening closed in around the airstrip with its usual tropical thoroughness, darkness arriving not gradually but decisively, as though the day had simply stopped. Bong went to find dinner. Tomorrow there would be another mission. There were always more missions. The arithmetic continued whether you thought about it or not. Tokyo, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, February 1944. The document was 41 pages long and had taken 3 months to compile. Commander Masatake Okamiya had written most of it himself, drawing on combat reports from every Pacific theater where P-38s had appeared in significant numbers. The Solomons, New Guinea, the Central Pacific, the long approaches to Rabaul that had been costing the 204th Air Group pilots at a rate that the training pipeline was no longer keeping pace with. He had interviewed surviving pilots. He had studied gun camera footage. He had requested, through channels that required patience and persistence, the technical specifications that Japanese intelligence had accumulated on the Lightning since its first appearance over Guadalcanal. The document said, in the careful language of a staff officer who understands that his superiors will read what he writes with the specific attention of men looking for reasons to disagree, that the situation was serious. It said this in 41 pages because 41 pages of evidence was what it took to make the word serious mean what Okamiya needed it to mean, rather than the softer, more manageable version of serious that institutional optimism preferred. The core finding occupied 3 paragraphs near the center of the document. Okamiya had written and rewritten these paragraphs more times than the rest of the report combined, because the core finding was the kind of finding that needed to be stated with complete precision or not stated at all. The P-38, he had written, does not defeat the Zero in the fight the Zero was designed to win. In low-speed horizontal maneuvering combat below 15,000 feet, the Zero retains meaningful advantages in turn radius and control responsiveness. The P-38 does not contest this fight. It imposes a different fight, vertical, high speed, conducted at altitudes where the Zero's engine produces diminishing power and its controls become progressively heavier. In this fight, the Zero has no answer. The directive that followed from this finding was the sentence that had required the most rewriting. Okamiya had drafted 7 versions before arriving at the one that said what needed to be said without saying more than the institution was prepared to hear. Pilots are advised to avoid engagement with P-38 type aircraft except under conditions of overwhelming numerical superiority and significant altitude advantage. He submitted the document and waited. The response, when it came, arrived in the form of a meeting rather than a written reply, which Okamiya recognized as the institutional equivalent of a conversation that needed to leave no record. 3 senior officers, a conference room that smelled of tobacco and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult things are discussed and then set aside. The senior officer present read the core finding aloud. Then he set the document down and looked at Okamiya with the expression of a man who has been handed a diagnosis he intends to dispute not on medical, but on philosophical grounds. "You are recommending," the senior officer said, "that our pilots run from the enemy?" Okamiya had prepared for this. "I am recommending," he said, "that our pilots survive to fight under conditions where they can win. A Zero pilot does not run." Okamiya said nothing. He had known, when he wrote the directive, that this was where the conversation would arrive. He had written the document anyway because the alternative, saying nothing, allowing the pattern to continue, watching the mathematics resolve themselves at the cost of pilots Japan could not replace, seemed to him a worse form of failure than saying something that would not be heard. The document was filed. The directive was distributed to squadron commanders with a classification that ensured it reached experienced officers and was not posted where younger pilots might read it and draw conclusions about what it meant. In Rabaul, Nishizawa received his copy, read it once, and placed it in his desk drawer without comment. He did not need the directive to tell him what he had understood in November of 1942, lying awake in his bunk with the intelligence report from August still in his pocket. He had been flying inside that understanding for more than a year. What the directive told him was that the institution had finally arrived at the place he had reached alone, in the dark, listening to Rabaul breathe. It had taken 15 months. It had cost, in that time, pilots he could name, men who had arrived at the same understanding the hard way, at altitudes where understanding came too late to be useful. He closed the drawer. Outside, the Rabaul flight line was busy with the ordinary sounds of an air group preparing for the next day's operations. Engines running up, ground crews moving between aircraft, the particular quality of organized noise that a functioning military unit produces. It was the sound of a machine that still believed in itself. Nishizawa listened to it for a moment. Then he went back to work. There was, still, a war. And he was still, for whatever the fact was worth in February of 1944, the best pilot in it. Philippines, October 25, 1944. The transport left Rabaul before dawn. Nishizawa was a passenger. This was the fact that would define the day. Not what he had done the previous afternoon, though what he had done the previous afternoon was extraordinary, but the simple, brutal fact that on the morning of October 26th, he was sitting in the fuselage of a Nakajima C-6N transport rather than in the cockpit of a Zero. The previous day, he had escorted the first official kamikaze mission to its target. 26 years old, 87 confirmed victories. He had watched the volunteers climb into their aircraft with the particular stillness of men who have made a decision that exists beyond the reach of doubt. And he had taken his Zero up alongside them and flown escort, and over the Philippines he had encountered American Hellcats and shot down 2 of them. His 86th and 87th victories, while the kamikaze pilots continued toward their targets below him. He had returned to base. The kamikaze pilots had not. That evening, by accounts that survived in the testimonies of men who had been present, Nishizawa had been quieter than usual. This was notable only because his usual was already quiet. He ate little. He sat outside after dinner and looked at the sky for a long time. Nobody disturbed him. The pilots who knew him understood that his silences were not invitations. In the morning, he boarded the transport for the return flight to Clark Field. The American fighters found the transport over the Philippines at mid-morning. They were Hellcats from a carrier group sweeping the area. Routine interdiction. The kind of mission that had become routine because American carrier groups now operated in Philippine waters with the ease of men working in their own territory. The transport had no fighter escort. Transports rarely did anymore. There were not enough fighters, and the fighters that existed were needed elsewhere. And the calculation that had once protected rear area flights had been revised by the same mathematics that Okamiya had documented in his 41-page report and that the institution had filed without acting on. The transport went down over Mindanao. Nishizawa was 36 hours removed from his 87th aerial victory. He was 26 years old. The man who had asked, in August of 1942, "What is our ceiling?" The man who had understood, before anyone around him, what the answer meant, died not in combat, but in the airspace that his enemy now owned so completely that moving through it required luck rather than skill. 3 years of war, 87 victories, shot down once over Guadalcanal in 1942, and had swum to shore. Survived wounds, survived mechanical failures, survived the accumulated probability that kills men of his profession far sooner than it had killed him. He did not survive the sky of October 1944. Nobody particularly skilled or particularly brave or particularly anything had taken him from it. The sky had simply stopped belonging to the side he was on, and that was sufficient. In Leyte Gulf that same day, the largest naval battle in history was ending. Japan had committed everything. The result was already decided. The sky above the Philippines was very blue and very clear, and entirely, irreversibly, American. Richard Bong died on August 6, 1945. Not over New Guinea, not over the Philippines, not in the cockpit of a P-38 with 40 victories behind him and a 0 somewhere below. He died in Burbank, California, 2 miles from the Lockheed factory where he had first sat in the prototype and said, "Like I get to decide." A test flight in a P-80 jet, the next aircraft, the future aircraft, went wrong on takeoff. He was 24 years old. The news reached the Pacific on the same day that Hiroshima received something else entirely. The war ended 9 days later. In September of 1945, American intelligence officers conducted debriefings at Atsugi Airfield outside Tokyo. Surviving Japanese pilots arrived in ones and twos, in civilian clothes, carrying the careful composure of men who have accepted a reality that has not yet finished arriving. They answered questions in the methodical, cooperative manner of professionals who have decided that honesty, at this point, costs nothing. The intelligence officers asked about aircraft, about tactics, about the moment the air war had turned. The answers, compiled from dozens of separate interviews conducted over several weeks, contained a pattern that the officers noted in their summary report. When asked specifically about the P-38, pilots who had never met each other, who had flown in different theaters and different units and different years of the war, gave answers that converged on the same word. Not speed, not firepower, not range, though they mentioned all of these. Choice. One pilot, his name was recorded, then lost in the bureaucratic processing of the occupation, described his first engagement with a Lightning over New Guinea in early 1943. He had been flying escort, positioned correctly, altitude adequate, formation intact. The P-38 had appeared above him, dived, fired, and climbed away before he could react. He had attempted pursuit. He had watched the Lightning continue climbing until it was beyond the ceiling his 0 could reach. He decided when to fight, the pilot said through the interpreter. He decided when to stop. I decided nothing. The intelligence officer wrote this down. He wrote it in the plain language of a man transcribing testimony rather than interpreting it, which was the correct approach because the testimony did not require interpretation. It was, in the end, a simple thing. Not simple to achieve. The engineering, the production, the training, the doctrine, the 2 years of combat refinement that had preceded that moment over New Guinea. None of that was simple. But the thing itself, the operational reality that the pilot was describing, was simple. One side chose, the other side responded. In every war, in every engagement, in every moment when the outcome hangs between two possibilities, that asymmetry is the whole story. The P-38 had not merely been faster or higher or better armed. It had given American pilots the gift that Nishizawa had recognized in reverse on the night he lay awake in Rabaul in August of 1942. The gift of determining the terms. Nishizawa had asked, "What is our ceiling?" and understood the answer before anyone around him did. He had carried that understanding for 2 years, flying with a skill that the mathematics could not touch, surviving everything the new reality could throw at a man of his ability. In the end, the mathematics had not needed to touch him. It had simply rearranged the sky until there was no safe passage through it, and he had been in the sky when that happened. The debriefings concluded. The occupation proceeded. The pilots went home to a country rebuilding itself from the foundation, learning a different kind of strength than the one that had sent them into the air with samurai spirit and an aircraft that could not climb to 12,000 meters. Somewhere in the Lockheed archives, the specification sheet for the XP-38 still exists. Service ceiling above 12,000 meters. The number that Nishizawa had read in a mess hall in Rabaul and folded into his pocket and carried until he had nothing left to carry. It was always just a number. It was always the whole story.